Hello everybody, thank you for watching my video. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe. Medieval kings are sometimes stereotyped as being brutish, violent, tyrannical warmongers. However, most of them were more complex than that, and actually there are several examples where that stereotype is completely contradicted. And in this video I'm just going to chat a little bit about the softer side of the personality or personalities of some of the kings of England during the medieval period. The first example of a king showing some nuance in his personality that I wanted to give was in 1152 when King Stephen spared the life of a 5-year-old William Marshal. William had been handed over to Stephen to ensure his father's John Marshal's good behaviour. John had been a pain in the backside to King Stephen for some time, and he would continue to be so even after he had handed his son over as hostage. Stephen now could have potentially have executed the boy as punishment for John's bad behaviour, but Stephen spared William after he had seen him ask to play with the spear of one of Stephen's soldiers. This shows you that there was a kindly nature to Stephen's personality. Unfortunately, throughout medieval history, there are examples of children being hanged. One example I can think of was a 7-year-old Scottish boy who was hanged by Edward III during one of the English sieges in Scotland during the 1330s. This was as punishment for the boy's father's particularly bad behaviour towards the English crown. This execution was actually carried out in front of the boy's father. So the power of Stephen's act of mercy should not be underestimated. To you or I today, not hanging a 5-year-old boy is something that should not even be considered an act of mercy, but the fact of the matter is we have to consider the times that we're talking about here, and Stephen's generosity to William was ironically his greatest legacy. Whilst he was a weak king, we should appreciate the fact that this might have been caused by the fact that Stephen actually had a rather nice personality, and perhaps he was too nice to actually become king and to rule strongly. Edward II is the second example I wanted to give of a more kindly and considerate king. Edward is possibly the most unusual king during medieval England. He is unusual in the sense that he pursued hobbies that were considered to be more suitable for the lower classes. And Edward seems to have had a more sympathetic attitude towards poorer people. He treated them with a respect and dignity that is unusual. He would reward handsomely labourers for carrying him out services, and he would talk to common people with respect and dignity, and talk to them for extended periods of time on various subjects. This did not always go down well, and there was a snobby attitude towards Edward and his behaviour towards poorer people in the chroniclers of the time. By the chroniclers of the time, I should say. And Edward, as his reign went on, further infuriated them by his attitudes towards his personal favourites like Piers Gaveston and later on the Spencers. Some people have gone on to call him a tyrant, but there is no doubt in my mind that Edward was nothing of the sort. There were times when he could be vengeful, and he was certainly vengeful against the men who brought about the downfall of Piers Gaveston, but Edward was not a nasty man, and if he had been a bit less naive when it come to his personal friends and allies, then he potentially could have gone on and had a long and successful reign. During his 20-year rule, the main bugbear with the chronicles and with the nobility at the time was his attitude towards people like Piers Gaveston. But as a man, he was actually rather likeable. Henry VI is the most famous example I can give of a kindly King of England during the medieval age. His genteel personality was quite unsuited to rule in the 15th century, though. He was surrounded by men who could not fully understand the man that he was, and they could not adjust to the man that Henry VI was. And as such, civil war was going to break out. Some people have questioned if Henry VI's father had lived longer, then perhaps he might have had a better example to follow, and he might have been a slightly tougher king, but I don't necessarily buy that. I think Henry VI was a naturally gentle man. And one of the nicest images that I think that I've come across during my research on the medieval period is a story told about Henry and his queen, Margaret of Anjou. During one bright day, during the spring one year, Henry and his queen sat in bed all day, laughing and joking and watching people coming in and out of their bedchambers. I think this is a particularly moving image because it shows you the type of man that Henry was, and it shows you the type of loving relationship he had with Margaret. Like Edward II that I mentioned in the previous clip, Henry was very unusual. He was deeply pious, which is not unusual for a medieval king, but he insisted on not taking mistresses, and he respected his wife greatly. Margaret must have appreciated this a tremendous amount, and I think it's partly due to that fact that she fought so hard to keep hold of the throne. Yes, she wanted to keep herself in power against the machinations of first Richard, Duke of York, and then the future Edward IV, but I think she also was desperate to fight on behalf of her husband, who I think she loved deeply as much as he seemed to love her. I don't think Henry VI necessarily gets the respect that he deserves. Yes, his reign led to civil war, but I think that is just as much in part to the tyranny of other people than is to his own weakness. If other men wanted to avoid civil war, it was possible. Unfortunately, their own grievances after the end of the 100 Years' War ultimately meant that disaster was always going to befall Henry VI. But as a man, I think he is particularly admirable. I don't think it's any great surprise that these three were regarded as three of our worst ever kings. Henry VI, in particular, was far too nice to rule. There was either too much naivety with them or a lack of ruthlessness. If you look at our most successful kings, Henry V, Edward III, Edward I, for example, they were all far tougher than these three men. Even the man that deposed Henry VI was probably too nice for his own good. Edward IV is described as affable and genial and actually a rather likeable man. And it's probably due to this that he allowed the Civil War to drag on as long as it did, eventually causing him to be deposed as well in 1470. So what this video I hope has shown is the complexities of being a medieval monarch, what it required for a king during this time period was actually you had to be really, really tough, and you had to be capable of sheer ruthlessness. Otherwise, like King Stephen, like Edward II, like Henry VI, you wouldn't survive.